The sound of the slap echoed through the great hall of the castle like a crack of thunder, followed by a deathly silence that made even the flames in the hearth seem to flicker and shrink. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Alice held her hand in the air, feeling the sting in her palm that had just marked Lord Carter's face, before the full magnitude of her actions crashed down upon her. She had struck the most powerful man in the fiefdom, in front of half a dozen witnesses, 3 days before their forced wedding. You little viper!" Carter's voice was a hiss, one hand touching the red mark spreading across his cheek, while the other clenched into a fist. His eyes blazed with a fury Alice had never seen before. Fury, and something else, something more dangerous, more primitive. "You have no idea what you've just done." "I know exactly what I've done," Alice said, lifting her chin, though she was trembling from head to toe. "I responded to your indecent proposal as it deserved." What had begun as a discussion about the final wedding arrangements had spiraled into a brutal confession when Carter revealed his true plans for her, and for Ethan Miller. Not only would the marriage be a political sham, but Carter intended to send Ethan on a suicide mission, a desperate charge that would guarantee his death, forever eliminating the obstacle to the total control he wished to exert over Alice and her family's fortune. "Indecent proposal?" Carter laughed, a humorless sound that made Alice's skin crawl. "I was being generous, offering you a marriage where you would at least know exactly where your loyalties should lie, but I see now you prefer to do things the hard way." He stepped toward her, and Alice could feel the danger radiating from him like heat from a forge. The servants who had witnessed the scene instinctively backed away, some whispering quiet prayers. 3 days. Carter stopped just inches from her, his voice low but thick with menace. "You have 3 days to act like the obedient lady I will pretend you are, or your dear knight will find that accidents happen with alarming frequency in the Northern Territories." "You wouldn't dare." But even as the words left her lips, Alice knew he would. "Don't test me, Lady Alice. I've killed men for less." The confession was a casual whisper, but its impact was devastating. And Ethan Miller would be neither the first nor the last to disappear for the sake of stability in this kingdom. Alice felt the blood run cold in her veins. This wasn't just a political threat. Carter was admitting he had taken lives to maintain his power, and that he would do so again without a second thought. "Now," he continued, straightening his tunic as if nothing had happened, "you will graciously apologize for your emotional outburst. You will smile when I touch your hand. And you will spend the next 3 days practicing how to be the silent, obedient wife I expect you to be. And if I refuse—" Carter smiled, and it was the most terrifying smile Alice had ever seen. "Then tomorrow, I will receive the tragic news that Sir Ethan Miller suffered a terrible accident during a routine patrol, a fall from his horse perhaps, or an unfortunate encounter with bandits. These things happen all the time." The blackmail was perfect in its cruelty. Alice knew she was completely trapped. Any resistance on her part would result in the death of the man she loved, and Carter knew it. 3 days, he repeated, running an icy finger over the red mark on his cheek where she had struck him. "And if, during that time, I discover you have tried to warn him or send any kind of message, well, accidents happen to young ladies too. Falls from the battlements can be so tragic." Alice closed her eyes, feeling the world narrow around her until only one impossible choice remained, her own happiness or Ethan's life. When she opened them again, a fierce resolve burned there, one that made Carter take a slight step back. "Fine," she said, her voice low but steady. "You win, for now." "Clever girl." Carter smoothed his hair, his aristocratic composure restored. "I knew there was a practical woman beneath that romantic facade." But as he turned to leave, Alice whispered something that made him pause in the archway. "Just remember, Lord Carter, that practical women are most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose." He turned back slowly, and Alice saw in his eyes that he understood her veiled threat. For a moment, predator and prey sized each other up in a deadly silence. Then Carter smiled again, that glacial smile that promised terrible consequences. 3 days, he repeated, and then he was gone, leaving Alice alone with the echo of her own brave words and the terrifying realization that she had just declared war on the most dangerous man in the kingdom. Outside, the storm that had brought Ethan back to the castle continued to rage, washing over the land as if trying to cleanse sins that had yet to be committed. And at the center of the political hurricane that was forming, a young woman touched her own cheek, where angry tears had begun to fall, knowing that the next 3 days would determine not only her fate, but the fate of everyone she loved. The afternoon rain fell with a fury that seemed bent on washing the world clean, turning the old road between Highford Castle and the market town of Redmere into a treacherous mire. Heavy drops hammered the uneven stones, creating small puddles that reflected the grey sky like shattered mirrors. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and moss, mixed with the metallic tang that heralded a worsening storm. Ethan Miller tightened his grip on the reins, the slick leather cold between his frozen fingers. His sodden gambeson clung to his shoulders like a heavy, uncomfortable second skin, and every shift of his horse sent a fresh trickle of icy water down his back. He'd spent the morning patrolling the fiefdom's borders, checking landmarkers, and speaking with watchtower guards about any suspicious movements. It was routine, necessary work, but it always left him with an odd sense of incompleteness, as if something greater was waiting for him just beyond these daily tasks. A sharp wind whipped across his face, carrying the distant sound of snapping branches and leaves torn from trees. Ethan pulled his hood lower, shielding his eyes from the driving rain, when a dark shape at the side of the road caught his attention. At first he thought it was just a large bush bent low by the gale, but something about the way it moved made him slow his horse to a walk. It was a woman. She was fighting the wind like someone trying to stand in a rushing current, her dark cloak plastered to her body by the rain, her head covered by a veil that looked more like a wet shroud. In her arms, she clutched something to her chest, a bulky bundle she protected as if her life depended on it. With every powerful gust, she staggered, but she always righted herself, refusing to yield to the storm. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just compassion, it was something deeper, more primal, as if every fiber of his being recognized a situation that demanded immediate action. Perhaps it was the result of his strict upbringing in the castle, where he'd been taught that protecting the helpless was more than a duty, it was a calling. Or maybe it was something inherited from his humble lineage, from people who knew what it meant to be at the mercy of the elements, with no one to turn to. Without hesitation, he dismounted. Icy water immediately seeped into his leather boots, but he ignored the discomfort. With swift movements, he untied the heavy cloak from his saddle, a thick dark wool treated with wax to resist the damp. It was one of the few valuable possessions he owned, a gift he'd received upon completing his knightly training. "My lady!" he shouted, his voice struggling to carry over the roar of the storm. "My lady, allow me to help you." The woman turned toward him, and even through the curtain of rain, Ethan could see her hesitate. There was pride in her posture, an iron-willed dignity that resisted the idea of accepting charity from a stranger. But there was also exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for far too long. "That's not necessary," she called back, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "I can manage on my own." Ethan moved closer, walking slowly so as not to alarm her. Up close he could see she was a woman of some years, with refined features that even the rain couldn't obscure. There was a quality to her movements, in the way she held the bundle, that spoke of noble birth and a fine education. But there was something else too, a quiet resolve that made him respect her all the more. "My lady, with all due respect," he said, holding the cloak out to her, "this storm is not safe for anyone. At least take this to shield yourself from the cold." She studied him for a moment, her dark eyes appraising him carefully. Ethan realized she was noting his every move, the respectful distance he kept, the careful way he offered the cloak without forcing it on her. It was as if she were accustomed to quickly judging the character of others, to distinguishing between genuine offers of help and those with ulterior motives. "I am a sworn knight of Highford Castle," he added, pulling back his hood so she could see his face clearly. "Ethan Miller at your service." The mention of his station seemed to put her slightly at ease. Lady Maren, for that was the name she would give him moments later, nodded with an almost imperceptible incline of her head and reached out a hand to accept the cloak. As their fingers brushed during the exchange, Ethan felt the chill of her skin and understood she had been in the storm for much longer than he'd imagined. "Lady Maren," she said, pulling the cloak over her shoulders with a motion that revealed a quiet relief. "I was traveling on family business and was caught unawares by the weather." Ethan nodded, noting how carefully she chose her words. There was something she wasn't saying, but he was not the kind of man to press for confidences. He glanced around, estimating the distance to the nearest village and weighing whether his horse could bear the extra weight. "The village of Millbrook is less than a league from here," he said. "There's a decent inn with a hearth and a hot meal. Allow me to escort you." "I cannot take your horse," she protested, but Ethan was already helping her mount. his steady hands offering support without being intrusive. "I'll walk," he replied simply. "I've endured far worse in worse conditions." It was true. Years of military training had taught him to withstand discomforts that would make other men quit. But more than that, there was something about this woman that awakened a protective instinct in him that went beyond mere duty. Perhaps it was the way she shielded the bundle, or the quiet dignity with which she faced adversity. Or perhaps it was simply that, in an age when so much in the kingdom seemed driven by self-interest and political calculation, this one small act of kindness was one of the few things that still made sense. They spoke little on the walk to Millbrook. The roar of the rain made conversation difficult, but Ethan sensed she was watching him, evaluating him with the same quiet intensity he reserved for opponents on the battlefield. There was a sharp intelligence behind those eyes, and a growing worry she was trying to conceal. When they finally reached the inn, a low-slung building of stone and timber with a warm yellow light spilling from its small windows, Ethan helped her dismount with the same careful ceremony. The rain had eased slightly, but it still fell with enough persistence to make it clear this was no night for travel. "Wait," Lady Maren said as he prepared to leave. There was an urgency in her voice, as if something important had just occurred to her. "Your name, you said it was Miller." "Yes, my lady, Ethan Miller." He saw something flash across her face, recognition perhaps, or a sudden understanding that left her visibly unsettled. But when she spoke again, her voice was controlled. "Thank you for your kindness, Sir Miller. May God protect you on your journey back." Ethan gave a respectful bow and swung himself back onto his horse, turning it toward the road. He didn't see the way Lady Maren remained in the doorway of the inn, watching him disappear into the rain with an expression that mingled gratitude with a deep and growing concern. Inside the warm inn, as she sat before the fire with the bundle finally safe in her lap, Lady Maren carefully opened it. It contained a set of important business documents, but also something more personal, letters her daughter Alice had written over the past few weeks, letters that mentioned with unsettling frequency a certain knight who had marked her youth. "Ethan Miller," she murmured to herself, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "So it's you." The name her daughter spoke with a mix of melancholy and secret hope. The man Alice was trying to forget to spare herself an impossible love was the same knight who had just sacrificed his own comfort to help a stranger on the road. The irony of the situation did not escape her, nor did the danger it represented. Outside, the storm continued its furious dance, washing the land and setting the stage for the events that would forever change the fate of everyone caught in this story of honor, love, and sacrifice. The great hall of Highford Castle held a tension so thick it was almost tangible as Lady Maren walked through its massive oak doors the morning after the storm. Golden light streamed through the high windows, casting geometric patterns on the polished stone floor, but even the brightness couldn't dispel the heavy atmosphere that hung in the air. Servants moved with quiet urgency, preparing the space for what was clearly an important gathering. Alice stood before the large window in the west wing, pretending to admire the gardens that stretched beyond the walls. But Lady Maren knew her daughter well enough to see the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed nervously against the sill. Something was wrong, a heavy expectation like a storm cloud about to break. "My daughter," Lady Maren's voice cut through the silence with studied softness. Alice turned, and her mother immediately noticed the pallor that marked her face like a bad omen. Her green eyes, usually so vibrant, seemed to have lost some of their light, replaced by a poorly concealed anxiety that made Maren's maternal heart ache. "Mother." Alice moved toward her, and Lady Maren could see that she had been crying, not much, but enough to leave faint traces around her eyes. "How was your journey? I heard there was a storm." "There was," Lady Maren said, choosing her words carefully as she watched her daughter's every reaction. "I had to take shelter on the road. A knight offered me his assistance." Alice froze. It was a nearly imperceptible shift, but Lady Maren, who had spent years learning to read the subtleties of court politics, didn't miss the way the muscles in Alice's neck tensed, the way her fingers stopped their nervous tapping. "A knight?" Her voice was too controlled, too artificial. "Ethan Miller." The name hung between them like a confession. Alice closed her eyes for a moment, and Lady Maren saw her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. When she opened them again, a raw vulnerability was there that broke her mother's heart. Is he all right?" The question escaped her lips like a sigh. "He is." Lady Maren stepped closer, taking her daughter's cold hands in her own. "Alice, we need to talk. There are things you need to know." Before Alice could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor. Measured, calculated steps. Lord Carter was approaching. Alice instantly straightened, her social mask falling back into place, but Lady Maren felt the slight tremor that ran through her body. "Lady Maren?" Carter's voice preceded him into the hall. He was dressed in his usual impeccable black, but there was something in his eyes that put Lady Maren on high alert. "I trust you've recovered from yesterday's storm." "Perfectly, Lord Carter. Thanks to the kindness of one of our knights." Carter smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, I heard about the encounter. Ethan Miller has always been a very helpful young man." The way he said the word helpful was laced with a hidden meaning, an insinuation that made Alice move almost imperceptibly closer to her mother. Lady Maren felt the tension radiating from her daughter's body like heat from a forge. "I came," Carter continued, "to formalize a few details of our union, Lady Alice. The council will meet tomorrow to give its final approval, and the betrothal ceremony is set for 3 days from now." Alice swallowed hard. So soon? The times demand swiftness." Carter drew nearer, and Lady Maren saw how Alice instinctively took half a step back. "There are political matters that cannot wait. Matters concerning the stability of the kingdom." "What kind of matters?" Lady Maren interjected, her voice carrying an authority she had learned to wield through years of trade negotiations. Carter turned to her, and Lady Maren saw something dangerous glint in his eyes, a hunger that went far beyond a political marriage. "There are rumors that some members of the lesser nobility are questioning certain administrative decisions, destabilizing elements that must be contained." He paused deliberately. "Impetuous young men who mistake loyalty for insubordination." The veiled threat was too clear to be ignored. Lady Maren felt Alice flinch beside her, understanding immediately to whom Carter was referring. "I see." Lady Maren's voice was dangerously quiet. "And this marriage would serve to consolidate authority." "Among other things." Carter smiled again, that predatory smile that made Alice's skin crawl. "An alliance between my administrative position and your family's commercial influence would create a beneficial balance for all involved. And for those not involved." Alice spoke for the first time since Carter had entered, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions Lady Maren knew was raging inside her. "Well," Carter shrugged with studied carelessness, "that would depend entirely on how well they understand their place in the order of things." Lady Maren felt a wave of revulsion so intense she had to summon all her negotiating experience to keep her expression neutral. This man wasn't just proposing a political marriage, he was setting a trap, and he planned to use Alice as bait to destroy anyone who threatened his power. "My daughter needs time to prepare properly," she said, maintaining a diplomatic tone. 3 days is far too short for a ceremony that will mean so much to our families." "Oh, but I disagree." Carter reached out to touch Alice's arm. "Lady Alice has always struck me as a very adaptable young woman." Alice dodged his touch with a subtle movement, but Carter noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly, a reaction that did not escape Lady Maren. "Of course," Alice murmured, forcing a smile that was nowhere near convincing. "I would just like to be certain that all the details are settled. All relevant details have been taken care of." Carter's voice hardened almost imperceptibly. "All that remains is to formalize what has already been decided." The sentence fell upon the hall like a tombstone. In that moment, Lady Maren understood that there was no room for negotiation. Carter wasn't asking for consent. He was announcing a conquest. "Well," she said finally, "if everything is already decided, I suppose there is nothing left to discuss." "Precisely." Carter bowed, a gesture that was more form than substance. "I shall leave you so that you may prepare yourselves accordingly." As he left, the silence that fell over the hall was deafening. Alice collapsed into a nearby chair, all the tension she had been holding back finally rushing to the surface. Her hands were shaking and Lady Maren could see tears welling in her eyes. "Mother," Alice whispered, her voice breaking. "He knows. Carter knows about Ethan, about how I feel." Lady Maren knelt before her daughter, taking her hands. "How can you be sure? The way he spoke, the threats, he's using me as a weapon against Ethan." Alice looked up, and Lady Maren saw a pain so deep it shattered her heart. "If I don't marry him, Ethan will pay the price. And if you do marry him," Lady Maren said softly, "you will pay the price for the rest of your life." Alice closed her eyes, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. "What do I do, Mother? How can I choose between my own happiness and his safety?" Lady Maren was silent for a long moment, thinking of the knight who had sacrificed his own comfort for a stranger in the storm. There was something in that gesture that spoke of a character she rarely encountered at court, something pure, genuine, and as worthy of protection as her own daughter. "Perhaps," she said at last, "the question isn't which choice to make, but how to find a third option that no one else sees yet." Alice opened her eyes, a flicker of hope shining through her tears. "Do you have an idea?" Lady Maren thought of the night in the rain, of the way he had refused thanks for what he considered simple duty. She thought of the quiet courage Alice showed every day, trying to protect the man she loved at the cost of her own happiness. "Not yet," she admitted, "but I have faith that we will find one." Outside, the clouds from the previous night's storm were finally breaking apart, revealing a blue sky that promised a new beginning. But inside the castle, the real storm was just beginning. The main hall of the castle had never seemed so imposing or so menacing as it did on the morning Lord Carter convened an extraordinary meeting of the council. The golden light slanting through the high windows cast patterns that danced across the banners hanging on the stone walls, but even that beauty couldn't mask the tension that hung in the air like a toxic perfume. Ethan stood among the other summoned knights, feeling the weight of the gazes that fell on him with unsettling frequency. Something was wrong, a predatory energy that put his soldiers' instincts on high alert. Beside him, Sir Robert, a veteran of many campaigns, murmured quietly, "Careful, boy, the vipers are in the nest today." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, Carter strode into the hall with the pomp of a man wielding absolute authority. He wore his signature impeccable black, but there was something different in his posture, a barely concealed satisfaction that reminded Ethan of a cat toying with a wounded mouse. "Lords of the Council, Knights of the Guard," Carter began, his voice echoing off the ancient stones, "I have summoned you today to address matters that directly concern the security and honor of our fiefdom." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The way Carter had pronounced the word honor carried a sinister weight. "As you know," Carter continued, pacing slowly in the center of the hall like a predator circling its prey, "we live in delicate times. Times when the stability of the kingdom depends on maintaining order and respecting the established hierarchies." Low murmurs rippled through the hall. The older council members exchanged worried glances, while the knights shifted uneasily in their positions. "Therefore," Carter paused, his eyes sweeping over the group until they found Ethan, "it is crucial that we investigate any behavior that could be interpreted as inappropriate." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Ethan felt every eye in the hall turn to him, and a cold understanding began to dawn in his chest. "Sir Ethan Miller," Carter called out, his voice like the unsheathing of a sword. "Step forward." Ethan walked to the center of the hall, each footstep echoing in the sudden silence. He could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, some concerned, some openly hostile. He kept his posture straight as he had been taught, but his mind raced, trying to understand where this was leading. "Yesterday," Carter began, his voice now laced with a formality that was more threatening than any shout, "you were seen escorting Lady Maren through a storm." "Yes, my lord." Ethan's voice was steady, despite the tension coiling in his gut. "I was offering assistance to a lady in distress." "Ah, yes, assistance." Carter smiled, but it was a predatory smile. "And tell me, Sir Miller, is it common for knights of your station to offer personal escorts to members of the high merchant class?" The question was a trap, and Ethan recognized it instantly. Any answer he gave could be twisted to incriminate him. If he said it was common, he would be admitting to an improper familiarity. If he said it was uncommon, he would be confessing to a breach of protocol. "I offered aid to a lady in peril," he answered carefully, "as any sworn knight would do." "Any knight?" Carter repeated the words, savoring them. "But not every knight has personal connections to the family in question, do they?" A deathly silence fell over the hall. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what Carter was implying. Somehow he knew about Alice. "I don't understand what you mean, my lord." "Don't you?" Carter circled him like a vulture. "Then perhaps we should clarify a few points. Lady Alice Maren. You know her?" The question struck Ethan like an axe blow. He could feel a cold sweat begin to form on the back of his neck, but he forced his voice to remain controlled. "I am acquainted with the lady, yes." "Ah, acquainted." Carter stopped in front of him, his eyes gleaming with ill-concealed malice. "And this acquaintance began when, precisely?" "I met Lady Alice when we were young, during a visit she made to the castle." "A visit?" Carter nodded slowly. "And since then you have maintained contact?" Ethan hesitated. A lie would be easy, But if Carter already knew more, the lie would only make things worse. The truth, however, could be just as dangerous. "We have met occasionally at social functions," he said finally. "Occasionally." Carter smiled, and Ethan knew he had walked right into the trap. "And during these occasional meetings, what did you discuss?" The question was impossible to answer without incriminating himself. Ethan could feel the eyes of the entire council on him, some members already whispering among themselves with growing disapproval. "Normal social conversation, my lord. Normal." Carter turned to the council, gesturing theatrically. "Gentlemen, I ask you, is it normal for a knight of minor lineage to cultivate a friendship with the heiress of an influential merchant house?" Murmurs spread through the hall. Ethan could see that Carter had carefully prepared the ground, planting seeds of doubt that were now blossoming into open suspicion. "More importantly," Carter continued, his voice rising, "is it appropriate for such a knight to be sent to rescue the matriarch of that same family on the eve of a politically crucial marriage?" The implication was clear and devastating. Carter was suggesting that Ethan had orchestrated the meeting with Lady Maren, perhaps to interfere with the impending marriage between Alice and Carter himself. "My lord," Ethan began, but Carter cut him off with an imperious gesture. "Sir Miller, do you deny that you harbor inappropriate feelings for Lady Alice?" The question echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Ethan felt the world narrow around him, every face turned toward him as if he were an animal on display. He could hear his own heart pounding in his ears, the blood hammering at his temples. To lie would be to betray everything Alice meant to him, but to tell the truth would be to sentence her to a life of humiliation and potentially ruin her family. "I hold Lady Alice in the highest regard," he said at last, choosing each word with extreme care. "Regard." Carter savored the word like fine wine. What kind of regard, precisely? Before Ethan could answer, the doors to the hall burst open. Every head turned as Lady Maren entered with Alice at her side, both dressed in formal attire that indicated they had planned to be there. Alice was pale, but her posture was straight and defiant. When her eyes met Ethan's, he saw a mixture of determination and desperation that made his heart both break and soar. "Lord Carter," Lady Maren said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I hope you didn't start without us. I believe this discussion concerns us directly." Carter turned slowly, and Ethan could see he hadn't anticipated this interruption. For a split second, a crack of irritation showed through his mask of control before it was quickly suppressed. "Lady Maren, Lady Alice," he said, inclining his head in a bow that fell short of respectful. "What a pleasant surprise, though I must say this is an official meeting of the council, of which our families are a part," Alice interrupted, stepping forward. Her voice was stronger than Ethan had expected, filled with an authority he hadn't known she possessed. "And if Sir Miller is being questioned about his conduct toward us, we certainly have the right to speak on his behalf." A murmur of approval ran through some of the council members. Ethan realized Carter had underestimated the Maren family's political influence, and that his attempt at public humiliation might just backfire. "Very well," Carter said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Then perhaps Lady Alice herself can clarify the nature of her relationship with Sir Miller." Alice lifted her chin, and Ethan saw in her the same quiet courage that had sent her across the old bridge at Redmere years ago to retrieve a lost brooch. "With pleasure," she said, and Ethan knew the real battle was just beginning. The silence that fell over the hall was so heavy, Alice could hear her own breath against the stone walls. Every eye was on her, some curious, some hostile, most simply waiting for the spectacle Carter had orchestrated. But among all those faces, only one mattered, Ethan's. He watched her with a mixture of awe, terror, and love that made her heart break and mend itself all at once. "The nature of our relationship," Alice repeated, savoring each word as she gathered her thoughts. She knew every syllable she uttered would be weighed, judged, and possibly used as a weapon against her or Ethan, but she also knew this was the moment she had to choose between the safety of a lie and the courage of the truth. "Sir Miller and I," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word, "have known each other for many years. When I was a girl visiting this castle with my family, he was kind enough to help me out of an embarrassing situation." "What kind of situation?" Carter interrupted, clearly hoping she would reveal something compromising. Alice allowed herself a small smile, remembering that distant day when she had lost her favorite brooch in the castle gardens. "I had lost a family heirloom in the gardens. Sir Miller, who was then just a squire, offered to help me look for it. We spent the entire afternoon searching every corner until we found it. An entire afternoon, Carter repeated, his eyebrows raised. Unchaperoned. My lady-in-waiting was present, Lady Maren interjected smoothly, her voice carrying an authority that made several council members nod, as she always was when my daughter left our quarters. Alice noted the flicker of frustration on Carter's face. He had hoped she would confess to some scandal, some impropriety he could use to justify his suspicions. Instead, she was presenting a perfectly respectable story. And ever since, Alice continued, I have held Sir Miller in high esteem. He demonstrated on that day and in every interaction since the kind of integrity and kindness that honors both his station and this castle. Esteem, Carter muttered, as if the word were poison. And has this esteem influenced any of your recent decisions? Alice knew he was referring to the impending wedding, trying to force her to admit that her feelings for Ethan affected her willingness to marry him. It was another critical moment, a question that could destroy everything if she answered it wrong. My esteem for Sir Miller, she said carefully, much like my esteem for many other honourable knights of this castle, has taught me what to expect from a man of true character. It is a standard I will carry with me in all my future decisions. The answer was diplomatically perfect, but Alice saw in Carter's eyes that he understood the underlying message. She was saying that Ethan had set a standard of character that he himself could not meet. Interesting, Carter said, his voice dangerously low. And would you say Sir Miller reciprocates this esteem? I believe, Ethan said, speaking for the first time since Alice had entered the hall, that I should answer for myself. Alice turned to him, surprised by the firmness in his voice. There was something different in his posture, a resolve she hadn't seen before. Sir Miller, Carter began, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. No, my lord, Ethan interrupted, taking a step forward. If my character is to be questioned in public, I have the right to defend it in public. A murmur of approval ran through the knights present. It was an ancient tradition, a knight's right to defend his honor before the council. Very well, Carter conceded, but Alice could see the ill-concealed irritation in his eyes. Defend yourself, then. Ethan straightened his shoulders, and Alice felt her heart pound as she witnessed the transformation in him. The shy, respectful young man gave way to the warrior, the man who had fought in campaigns and faced dangers she could barely imagine. I love Lady Alice Maren, he declared, his voice ringing against the ancient stones of the hall. The impact of his words was immediate. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the crowd, some shocked, others clearly moved by the raw honesty of his declaration. Alice felt tears well in her eyes, not of sorrow but of a dizzying mix of relief and terror. I love her, Ethan continued, as a man should love the woman he would choose above all others. I love her intelligence, her kindness, her courage. I love the way she sees the world with eyes that have not yet been corrupted by cynicism and political manipulation. Carter had gone pale, clearly not expecting such a direct and disarming confession. But, Ethan went on, his voice now laced with a deep sadness that made Alice want to run to him, I also respect her position, her family, and her right to make her own choices. I have never interfered with her commitments, never pushed for attention she did not wish to give, and never used my position to place her in a compromising situation. He turned to Alice, and as their eyes met, she saw all the love he had kept silent for years. If my love for her is a crime, he said, turning back to Carter, then I plead guilty. But love is not treason, Lord Carter. Treason would be to lie about my feelings or to manipulate situations for personal gain. The implicit accusation in his final words was too clear to be ignored. Carter was being indirectly accused of the very thing he was trying to project onto Ethan. Sir Miller, a voice from the council said, Lord Aldrich, one of the most respected members, your honesty is admirable, but surely you understand that personal feelings cannot interfere with necessary political alliances. I understand that perfectly, Ethan replied, which is why I have never tried to interfere. Until yesterday, Carter interjected quickly, trying to regain the offensive, when you conveniently rescued Lady Maren on the eve of an important family meeting. I rescued a lady in distress, Ethan countered, his voice hardening. If Lord Carter is suggesting I should ignore people in need to avoid political misunderstandings, then I question what kind of knight he would have me be. It was a brilliant stroke, and Alice saw several council members nodding in approval. Ethan had turned Carter's accusation back on him, suggesting that Carter would prefer knights who placed political convenience above moral duty. That is not what I said, Carter snapped, but his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Then what are you saying exactly?" Lady Maren interjected, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "That my family should be grateful for being rescued, but suspicious of the rescuer's motives. That we should accept kindness as a matter of course, but punish the one who offers it." The logic was flawless, and Alice saw Carter realize he had lost control of the narrative. His attempt to publicly humiliate Ethan had turned into an exposé of his own questionable motives. "Lords of the Council," Alice said, knowing this was the moment to deliver the final blow, "you have heard Sir Miller confess his love for me with an honesty few men would have the courage to show. You have heard him admit that he has respected my position and never tried to interfere with my commitments. I ask you, what crime is there in that?" She paused, letting the question hang in the hall. "And I ask you this as well. What kind of man sets political traps based on another's honest love? What kind of leader uses genuine feelings as a weapon to destroy reputations?" The silence that followed was deafening. Alice could feel the moment crystallizing around her, as if the fate of everyone present was being decided in that instant. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the king himself spoke. No one had noticed his arrival, but there he stood in the entrance to the hall, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something that looked like approval. "An interesting question, Lady Alice," he said, his voice carrying the absolute weight of royal authority, "and one that deserves a proper answer." The king's presence in the hall completely transformed the atmosphere. What had been a public accusation orchestrated by Carter moments before had now become something far more serious, a matter of direct royal interest. Alice felt her heart hammer against her ribs as she realized the words she had spoken were no longer just a defense of Ethan, but a declaration made before the supreme authority of the kingdom. The king advanced slowly into the hall, his presence commanding absolute silence. He was a man in his middle years, with graying hair and eyes that had witnessed decades of political intrigue. When he spoke, it was with the authority of one who had learned to read human motivations like battle maps. "Lord Carter," he said, his voice echoing off the ancient stones, "explain to me why you felt it necessary to conduct this interrogation." Carter straightened, clearly trying to regain his composure, but Alice could see the sheen of sweat on his brow. "Your Majesty, it was simply a matter of maintaining order and investigating potentially inappropriate behavior." "Inappropriate." The king repeated the word, savoring it. "And what behavior would that be, precisely?" "Sir Miller has shown excessive familiarity with the Maren family, potentially interfering with important political alliances." The king turned to Ethan, studying him with eyes that seemed to pierce straight to the soul. "Sir Miller, do you deny this accusation?" "I do not deny that I have known the Maren family for years, Your Majesty, nor do I deny that I hold them in the highest regard, but I deny any attempt to interfere with their political commitments." "And yet," Carter interjected quickly, "just yesterday he personally involved himself in—" "Lord Carter," the king cut him off, his voice taking on a tone of icy warning, "allow me to conduct my own inquiries." The ensuing silence was tense enough to be cut with a sword. Alice could see that Carter was finally understanding he had made a grave error by forcing this situation in front of the king. "Sir Miller," the king continued, "I understand you recently returned from a campaign in the north. What was the situation there?" The change of subject was so abrupt that Alice blinked in confusion, but Ethan answered promptly. "Complex, Your Majesty. The peasants were restless over high taxes, but I discovered the situation was not as simple as it appeared." "Continue." "Many of the protests were organized by mercenaries paid by local lords who wished to destabilize the region to win land concessions. The truly needy peasants were being used as pawns." Alice saw genuine interest spark in the king's eyes. "And how did you handle it?" "I negotiated directly with the legitimate peasant leaders, offering a hearing for their real grievances while isolating the mercenaries. The region was pacified without needless bloodshed." "Interesting." The king nodded slowly. "And the other knights who were sent, how did they react to this unorthodox approach?" Alice realized this was no casual question. The king was testing something. "Some questioned my methods, Your Majesty. They felt I should have used brute force to end the protests quickly." "And Lord Carter?" The king turned to Carter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What was your guidance for handling the situation in the north?" Carter visibly paled. I believe in maintaining order through established methods." "Established methods?" The king repeated the phrase, and Alice could feel the danger in the room swell like a gathering storm. And these methods would include swift suppression of any resistance, Carter answered, clearly realizing too late that he was walking into a trap. Even when the resistance is legitimate, even when there are ways to resolve the conflict without violence? Carter's silence was answer enough. Sir Miller, the king turned his attention back to Ethan. I must confess, I was testing you. The situation in the north was deliberately engineered to see how different members of my administration would react to a complex crisis. Alice felt her heart stop. The king had been testing Ethan. Your reports were exceptional. Your ability to distinguish between genuine unrest and political manipulation, your skill in negotiating rather than simply destroying, these are qualities I need in my counselors. A ripple of shock went through the hall. Alice saw Carter's eyes widen in disbelief and dawning horror. Lord Carter, the king continued, his voice now carrying a relentless authority, your reports, on the other hand, recommended a complete cleansing of the region, full military suppression of all protests, regardless of their cause. Your Majesty, I only thought that you thought of solutions that would have resulted in dozens of unnecessary deaths and turned a manageable situation into a full-blown rebellion. The king took a step toward Carter, and Alice could see the terror growing in the man's eyes. You recommended violence when diplomacy was possible. You recommended a massacre when justice was needed. The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. And now, the king continued, I find you using state resources to conduct personal vendettas against knights whose only crime is to love honestly and serve faithfully. Carter tried to protest, but the king silenced him with a gesture. Sir Miller, the king said, turning to Ethan, I have a proposal for you. Alice felt an icy knot form in her stomach. A royal proposal was not something one could refuse. I need men of integrity in positions of responsibility, men who can see beyond their own ambitions, who can distinguish between justice and convenience. The king paused. I am offering you the position of regional advisor for the Northern Territories. The impact of the offer was immediate. It was a position of immense prestige and power, a promotion that would elevate Ethan far above his current station, one that would make him worthy of any marital alliance. Your Majesty, Ethan began, clearly struggling to process what was happening. The position comes with land, a title, and the authority to govern 3 counties. The king smiled, and this time the smile was genuine. I believe that should resolve certain social discrepancies that some have found problematic. Alice felt tears begin to well in her eyes. The king was offering Ethan not just a position, but the possibility of a future that had seemed impossible moments ago. And what of Lord Carter? Ethan asked, showing a generosity of character that made Alice's heart swell even more. Lord Carter, the king said, turning to the man who now looked as if he had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes, will be transferred to an administrative post in our eastern territories, far from here, effective immediately. It was exile in all but name, and everyone in the hall understood it. Lady Alice, the king turned to her with a fatherly smile, I imagine this new situation might influence certain future marital decisions. Alice looked at Ethan, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and caution, as if he still couldn't believe this was really happening. Yes, Your Majesty, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming freely down her face. I believe it will. The hall erupted in murmurs of approval and astonishment. Alice ran to Ethan, who caught her in his arms as if she were the answer to every silent prayer he had ever made. How? She whispered into his shoulder. Sometimes, he answered, holding her as if she might vanish at any moment. The truth is the only weapon we need. Lady Maren watched them with tears in her eyes, finally understanding that the knight who had helped her in the storm was exactly the man her daughter deserved, and that the kingdom recognized it too. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake not destruction, but renewal. And at the center of it all, 2 hearts were finally free to love without fear. The soft afternoon light filtered through the windows of the small solar in the Maren family's quarters, casting a golden glow that stood in stark contrast to the tension of the morning's events. Alice sat by the hearth, still trying to process the extraordinary turn of events that had reshaped her destiny in a matter of hours. Ethan was beside her, closer than they had ever dared to be in public, their hands clasped in an intimacy they could finally afford themselves. Lady Maren watched the couple from her favorite armchair, a goblet of warm wine in her hands, and an expression of deep satisfaction she couldn't hide. There was something profoundly comforting in seeing her daughter finally at ease, free from the constant strain she had carried on her shoulders for months. I still can't believe it, Alice murmured, squeezing Ethan's hand as if to constantly confirm he was really there. Everything changed so quickly. The king has been planning this for months, Ethan explained, his voice holding a reverence that showed he was still adjusting to his new reality. The situation in the north, the test of how different advisors would react. He's known for a long time that Carter was unfit for his position. But why didn't he act sooner? Lady Maren asked, genuinely curious. Because he needed public proof of each man's character. Ethan turned to Alice with a smile that mixed admiration and gratitude. Until this morning, it would have been his word against Carter's. But when Carter showed his true colors in front of the entire council, when he revealed he was willing to destroy lives for personal gain, he hung himself with his own rope, Lady Maren finished with satisfaction. Alice still felt a pang of disbelief when she thought about how the morning had begun with her resigned to a loveless marriage and ended with the possibility of a future that felt like a dream. "Ethan," she said softly, turning to face him, "when you confessed your feelings in front of everyone, you couldn't have known the king was coming. You risked everything." "I couldn't pretend anymore," he replied, lifting her hand to his lips and placing a soft kiss on her fingers. "Seeing you forced to defend yourself, knowing it was because of me, I couldn't stand by in silence and let you pay the price for my feelings alone." Lady Maren felt tears prick her eyes. There was something in the quiet devotion of this young knight that touched her deeply. She remembered him in the storm, offering his own cloak without hesitation, and understood that his kindness had not been an isolated act, but a reflection of who he truly was. "Mother," Alice turned to her, "how did you know we should be at the council meeting?" Lady Maren smiled, taking a sip of her wine. "Let's just say I have my sources among the staff. When I heard Carter had called an extraordinary meeting and that Ethan was being summoned to testify, it wasn't hard to deduce his intentions." "You knew he would try to use us as a weapon against Ethan," Alice said, her words a statement, not a question. "I did. And I also knew it was time for you to decide, once and for all, what future you wanted for yourself." Lady Maren leaned forward, her gaze fixed on her daughter. "You spent months sacrificing yourself to protect Ethan, accepting a loveless marriage to ensure his safety, but the time had come when only the courage of the truth could save you both." Alice nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom behind her mother's decision. "And if it had gone wrong, if the king hadn't shown up, then we would have faced the consequences together," Lady Maren answered simply. "But I knew Ethan's character from that night in the storm. A man who sacrifices his own comfort for a stranger in need is not someone who should be destroyed by petty politics." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to such high praise. "Lady Maren, I only did what any decent knight would do." "No," she countered firmly. "You did what any knight should do, but what very few actually do. There is an important difference." A comfortable silence settled between them. Alice could hear the distant sounds of the castle returning to its normal rhythm after the morning's upheaval. Servants walked the halls, quiet conversations echoed through the thick walls, and gradually the atmosphere of crisis gave way to a sense of renewal. "What happens now?" Alice asked, looking from Ethan to her mother. "Now," Ethan said, his voice taking on a resolve she recognized from his days of military training, "I accept the position the king has offered me. I learned to govern the northern territories. I proved that his faith in me was not misplaced." "And us?" The question came out quieter than Alice had intended, laden with a vulnerability she was still learning to allow herself. Ethan turned to her fully, taking both of her hands in his. "Alice, I know everything has happened so fast. I know you've just escaped a forced marriage and you might need time to—" "Ethan," she cut him off gently, a smile beginning to form on her lips. "I've spent years pretending I didn't love you. I don't intend to waste any more time pretending I need to think about this." The relief that washed over his face was so palpable that Lady Maren felt like an intruder on a deeply private moment. "Well then," she said, rising discreetly, "I suppose we have a wedding to plan. A real one this time." Alice laughed, a clear, genuine sound that filled the solar with joy. "Yes, Mother, a real wedding." When Lady Maren left to give the couple their privacy, Alice found herself alone with Ethan for the first time in years, without the need to maintain distance or feign indifference. The freedom was almost dizzying. "Are you sure you're ready to become the wife of a regional advisor?" he asked with a playful smile. "It's a position that will demand a great deal from you." "Ethan Miller," she replied, moving closer. "I survived months of Lord Carter's political manipulations. I survived the prospect of a loveless marriage. I survived pretending I didn't love you. Governing the Northern Territories will be a cakewalk compared to that." He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that made her realize how rarely she had heard him truly happy. There had always been a shadow of melancholy about Ethan, the quiet sorrow of a love he believed was impossible. Now at last, she could see him as he was meant to be, truly content. "There's one thing that still puzzles me," she said, leaning against him and feeling the comfort of being exactly where she belonged. "How did the king know he could trust you? How was he so sure you weren't just another ambitious young man trying to climb the social ladder?" Ethan was silent for a moment, considering the question. "Do you remember the brooch you lost in the gardens, when we were young?" "Of course." "Why?" The king was watching from the west tower. He saw an inexperienced squire spend an entire afternoon searching for a lost piece of jewelry for a young visitor, refusing to give up even as it grew dark. Ethan smiled at the memory. Apparently, it made an impression on him. "He told me today that was the first time he realized I had potential." Alice felt tears well in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of a happiness so pure it almost hurt. "So it all started that day. It all started that day," he confirmed, kissing her forehead gently, "when a brave young lady decided to trust a clumsy squire to help her find something precious she had lost. And now," he said, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her shiver, "we've found something even more precious. We've found our way back to each other." Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky, painting the castle in golden hues that promised a radiant future. And inside the small solar, two hearts, finally free to love without fear, began to plan a life that would be built on the strongest foundation of all: truth, courage, and a love that had survived every obstacle the world had thrown in its path. 3 weeks had passed since the day that changed everything, and Highford Castle was buzzing with preparations for an event that promised to be very different from the grim ceremony that had almost taken place. The chapel was being decorated with wildflowers Alice had insisted on, rather than the formal roses traditionally favored for noble weddings. There was something powerfully symbolic in the choice, flowers that grew free, uncultivated, reflecting the genuine nature of the love being celebrated. Alice was in her chambers, being helped by her ladies-in-waiting to try on the gown her mother had commissioned for the occasion. It was a dress of white silk with delicate gold thread embroidery, elegant without being ostentatious, beautiful without being pretentious. Unlike the gown that had been prepared for her wedding to Carter, a heavy, formal creation that had made her feel like a doll, this one made her feel like herself, only more radiant. "Lady Alice," said Margaret, her eldest lady-in-waiting, "I've never seen you look so luminous." Alice smiled, admiring her reflection in the polished silver mirror. It was true. There was something different about her, a vitality that shone from within. The months of tension and melancholy resignation had been replaced by an energy that made her seem both younger and more alive. "It's what happens when you can finally stop pretending to be someone you're not," she replied, adjusting a stray lock of hair. A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. Lady Maren entered, carrying a small carved wooden box that Alice recognized as a family heirloom, passed down through generations. "My dear," Lady Maren said, her expression solemn but warm, "there is something I must give you." Alice watched, curious, as her mother opened the box to reveal a pearl necklace that seemed to catch and reflect the light in an almost magical way. It was an ancient piece, clearly crafted by master artisans in an era when beauty was valued over show. "This necklace," Lady Maren explained, carefully lifting it from the box, "belonged to your great-grandmother and to her great-grandmother before her. It has always been passed to the women of our family on their wedding day, but only when they marry for true love." Tears welled in Alice's eyes. "Mother, your grandmother did not wear it when she married your grandfather. That was an arranged match, respectful but without passion. She once told me she saved the necklace, hoping I would be fortunate enough to find true love." Lady Maren began to fasten the necklace around Alice's neck, her fingers trembling slightly with emotion. "And I saved it, hoping you would have the same fortune." "And now?" Alice asked, touching the pearls that seemed to radiate warmth against her skin. "Now I know you will." Lady Maren stepped back to admire the effect. "Ethan looks at you the way your great-grandmother described a man should look at the woman he has chosen to share his life with, as if you are the answer to a question he didn't even know he was asking." A shiver of happiness ran through Alice. There was something deeply moving about being connected to generations of women in her family through this tradition, especially knowing she was finally living the kind of love that had inspired its creation. Another knock at the door, this one more urgent. Margaret opened it to reveal a young page, his cheeks flushed from running. "Lady Alice," he said, catching his breath, "Sir Ethan humbly requests your presence in the gardens. He says there is something he wishes to show you before the ceremony." Alice exchanged a puzzled look with her mother. "In the gardens? Now?" "Begging your pardon, my lady," the page added, "but he specifically said to come to the place where you first met." Alice's heart leaped. The spot where she had lost her brooch all those years ago, when they were still children, and the world had seemed full of endless possibility. "Go," Lady Maren encouraged with an understanding smile. "I'll finish the preparations here." Alice grabbed a light shawl and followed the page through the familiar castle corridors, down the stairs that led to the inner gardens. It was mid-afternoon, and the golden light filtering through the leaves cast dancing patterns on the stone paths. When she reached the designated spot, a small clearing surrounded by wild roses, where her first real conversation with Ethan had taken place, she found him standing near the stone bench where they had sat that distant day. But something was different. The ground was covered in white rose petals, creating a natural carpet that transformed the ordinary space into something magical. "Alice," he said when he saw her, and something in his voice made her heart race. "Ethan, what is all this?" she asked, approaching slowly, noticing he seemed nervous in a way he hadn't been even before the king. I wanted there to be a moment that was just for us before the ceremony," he explained, holding out his hand to her. "A moment where we could speak without protocol, without formality, just the two of us." Alice took his hand, letting him guide her to the center of the fragrant clearing. "And what did you want to talk about?" Ethan stopped, turning to face her fully. His eyes reflected the golden afternoon light, and Alice could see in them a depth of emotion that made her tremble. "I want to talk about promises," he said softly. "Not the promises we'll make in the chapel in front of everyone, but the promises I want to make only to you, here, where it all began." Alice felt tears begin to form again, but these were tears of a happiness so intense it was almost painful. "I promise," Ethan continued, his hands enveloping hers with a gentleness that spoke of years of secret dreams, "that I will never forget how I felt the day you trusted me to help you find something you had lost. It was then I knew I wanted to spend my life helping you find anything you ever needed." "Ethan," she began, but he placed a gentle finger on her lips. "I promise I will protect not just your safety, but your happiness. I will champion your dreams as if they were my own. I will support you when you want to change the world, and I will hold you when the world tries to change you." Alice was crying openly now, but they were tears of a joy so pure it seemed to radiate from every cell in her body. "And I promise," he said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion, "that I will love you not just on the easy days, when everything is right, but especially on the hard days, when we need each other to remember what's worth fighting for." "My turn," she managed to say, placing her hands on his face and feeling the rough texture of the beard he had grown in recent weeks, another sign of how their lives had changed. "I promise I will trust you not just with my heart, but with my fears, my doubts, my vulnerabilities. I will share with you not just my joys, but my burdens." Ethan closed his eyes,